On today's special crossover edition of Locked On Kraken and Locked On Wild, it is a squad cast as we preview the matchup between the Wild and the Kraken, and we also take a look at a couple of young centers getting it figured out at the NHL level in Matty Beniers and Marco Rossi. Let's fire it up.
You are Locked On Kraken, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into a special crossover edition of Locked On Kraken and Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken and the Minnesota Wild, and your team each and every day. We thank you for making both shows your first listen each and every day. Make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube. And if you listen on one of the many audio platforms, we appreciate having you along. We don't care where you listen. We care that you do make both shows part of your day each and every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode, Ayala joins for a squad cast as we talk about the start of the season for the Seattle Kraken and the Minnesota Wild. We'll dive into the start of the Dan Bylsma era. We'll dive into the nitty-gritty of the game between these two teams. And we'll talk about a couple of young centers that are finding their way in the NHL in Marco Rossi and Matty Beniers. My name is Seth Toupal, captain of Locked On Wild. I was going to say captain of the SS Locked On Wild. I'm trying to do all these like nautical puns because we got Erica in town here for Wild Kraken helping us with this squad cast. And Erica, glad to have you on this crossover episode. We haven't had a chance to do a ton of these, but anytime we do, it's been a blast.
For sure. Thanks so much for having me, Seth, and excited to, of course, preview the weekend matchup. But as you said, always nice to link up.
Yes, it is a lot of fun. Now we'll start with some Seattle, and then we'll work our way to Minnesota Wild because I'm sure you got some questions for me as to the start to the season and some of the particulars. But I got to ask you. There was a lot made, and I know because I've been doing some assisting behind the scenes with Locked On Kraken. So I know just about how much hype there was in this new era of Kraken hockey. Dave Hakstol out as head coach. Bring in Dan Bylsma, who obviously has a ton of experience from previous stops at the NHL level. And so from what you've been able to see from preseason, from the offseason, and from game one of the season, what has stuck out to you the most about what Dan Bylsma is looking to do for this Kraken franchise?
Without question, Dan Bylsma wants this team to work at a much faster pace. That has been something that has been preached from the organization effectively since the, at the time, pretty surprising, maybe not completely shocking, but surprising news that the organization was going to make a head coaching change. I've been on the record saying, and I still do think it could be true, that some of what we had seen as pretty much the complete breakdown from going to the playoffs to not in a big way had to do with likely decisions at the front office. That being said, now that we've seen just one game as of yet under Dan Bylsma in the regular season, his approach to the team is night and day to Dave Hakstol. So in playing fast, a lot of how he set up training camp and even the preseason was very different, and something that I have been advocating for on Locked On Kraken. I felt that maybe there wasn't enough rigor, there wasn't enough real true competition on the ice. There wasn't enough juice, as Dan Bylsma would say, in the preseason and in training camp. And under Dave Hakstol, that led to, I'm going to put the inaugural season to the side because there were a lot of COVID. There was COVID testing that year. There was just a lot of stuff going on. But outside of that, there were times where the Seattle Kraken would start preseason looking okay, you know, as much as you can tell in preseason, and then absolutely bomb the first few weeks of the season, including canceling practices while also looking arguably out of game shape. I don't know how you do both of those things, and so the guys were talking, their legs were tired, they were getting after it on the ice, and Dan Bylsma has brought that. He's brought the energy, he's brought the intensity, he's heightened a lot of expectations, I think, while also bringing some fun to the team.
Yeah, that's a key element. It's interesting too. You talk about just trying to kind of speed things up. I think the Wild were in a very similar situation when Dean Evison was let go. It's so hard to try to be like we're going to slow you down when so many teams are trying to speed it up. Like it's so hard to do that because, you're just running opposite of what a lot of teams are doing. And so that is interesting to hear, just that Bylsma is looking to, just kind of move this thing towards more of a modern style. There were a lot of moves made in the offseason, a lot of contracts, Chandler Stevenson and Brandon Montour, the big ones, but we've seen some extensions handed out
Yes.
by Ron Francis here over the last several months. And so, what is your thought on these moves that we've seen Ron Francis make to really take this group and try to add some pieces to it, but also lock in what this Kraken roster already has?
Yeah, I love this question because effectively I'm going to kind of call myself out here for a little bit, because it's one thing to say you think it's a front office problem, and then you go and say also, okay, you made changes, but I don't know if that's what I wanted you to make, And so I just want to preface with that, but I think that's where the fan base is. We needed something to change. I, again, have been advocating for the front office to really do something. First day of free agency, 14 million dished out between two signings. You mentioned Brandon Montour, Chandler Stevenson, big contracts. And I think the 7 years was really what was throwing people at that AAV. So is it the right move? We don't know yet, and we won't know for a while. That being said, what we do know is that on day one of free agency, on paper, the Seattle Kraken was a better hockey team than they were in their last regular season game the year prior. So I think we're still trying to figure out over time. And we actually talked about this on Locked on Kraken earlier this week. We had Zane Begg, who is he's the manager over at Davy Jones locker room. And we were talking about the moves that were made in a vacuum versus over time. Where are we going to settle? And I don't think we know yet. I don't think we'll know if Ron Francis, quote unquote, won these, especially not with just game 2 coming up against the Minnesota Wild. We're not going to know anytime soon. That being said, there is, I suppose, what we're hoping is a step in the right direction to actually have a direction for the Seattle Kraken. Part of my frustration with the front office is feeling like we were conservative in a lot of ways when, again, now I will put the inaugural season back on the table. We knew after that inaugural season that the roster needed to change. And there were a lot of carryovers that have happened even leading up to this year. So I do like the additions. And the most recent news that we got was Joey Daccord. And to me, that signals hope. I'm hoping, I should say, that it signals that there's a willingness for this organization to reestablish its core. Joey is a young goaltender. He's scrappy. Is he the better? Is he our A1 goaltender right now? I don't think we know. Again, he didn't start game 1. Philip Grubauer did. We lose that game at home. Not a goaltending issue in my estimation overall. But, there's still a lot that we need to learn about the Seattle Kraken that will instruct if those were the right moves. But overall, I like Joey. I like that we extended Joey. Adam Larsson is another player, and I think that is solid. I am on the record as not being pleased with the Seattle Kraken defense overall, both as our defensemen as well as how we play team defense. That being said, Adam Larsson is an anchor for this team. He's one of the alternate captains, and for good reason. So the most recent additions or extensions of Larsson and Daccord we're hoping are showing that this Seattle Kraken team wants to get serious about the guys that have been with the organization for a while, which then means, I think, perhaps at the trade deadline at the latest, that some other pieces may be on the move.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see. You know, I feel like the Wild are kind of in a similar spot there too, with maybe a few people get shipped out depending on how things go. Before we shift gears to Wild coverage, we got to talk about Jessica Campbell a little bit.
Yeah.
First full-time female assistant coach in the NHL, but you know, it's her answer, I think, was just fantastic. And just talking about, look, I'm glad that I'm the first to do it, but I want to just make this so that, you know, the next and the next and the next have an opportunity to do the same. And so as much as she enjoys being that trailblazer, it just, to her, is just, she's just part of the coaching staff and just looking to help this Kraken team win.
For sure. And another thing is that she, of course, for herself enjoys it. She does not like talking about it. And I think another thing that's really important about Jessica and that I appreciate is that she also took time to say that while she's visibly one of the women of the Seattle Kraken organization, that's just it. She's one woman. There have been women who are in leadership roles to even get her a role with Coachella Valley. And she took time to honor and appreciate that there are other women and other people representing other groups that are unfortunately underrepresented in hockey that are also making history. And I really respected that she did that, because those stories sometimes get lost as well. Whether it's an out LGBTQ trainer on the Seattle Kraken making history with the assistant GMs who have now moved on, and Cami Granato and so many things. So Jessica Campbell also she loves hockey. She is an excellent hockey mind, and being able to talk to her, we've had her on the podcast a few times, being able to talk hockey with her, but especially player development with Jessica Campbell is so much fun. And it goes back to what I was saying about maybe what the front office is doing, leaning into the youths, as we say. And it goes to Dan Bylsma's philosophy and his ethos. In addition to that fun and playing fast, he also believes in developing even veteran NHL players, and having a person like Jessica Campbell on his staff is really going to help push the needle to where the Kraken overall, again, seem like they want to go. So she's been great. Can't wait to see what she does. And also, this is an opportunity for her to learn and grow under some great coaches that have had, as you mentioned, several different stops, and they're really trying to do something special in Seattle altogether.
Yeah, not only Dan Bylsma, but also former Wild assistant
That's
Bob
right.
Woods.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yes.
On the staff. So there's another Wild Kraken tie. Let's shift gears, talk a little Wild, because I'm sure the Kraken listeners are looking for maybe a little intel on what to expect from the hosts in this matchup. So we'll talk Wild, and we'll finish by taking a look at some of the young players on both sides as we continue this special crossover edition of Locked on Wild and Locked on Kraken after this. Today's episode is brought to you by Indeed. We are constantly driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. Plus, listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Welcome back to today's special crossover edition of Locked On Wild and Locked On Kraken. Once again, both shows are your team each and every day. Reminder for Locked On Wild listeners, we will be live the moment puck drop. Well, a few minutes after puck drop for this one for you from the XL Energy Center. We'll take your comments. We'll get to John Hines' post-game comments as well. And we got a lot coming at you. So we'll have you covered after the game. So make sure to tune in right from the Locked On Wild YouTube channel. All right, Erica. Any Wild-related questions you have for me? I'm ready. I'm an open book.
Yes, I love it. I am, and Locked On Kraken listeners probably know this, but I am I'm always very curious on how teams set up their training camp, because again, from the Seattle Kraken perspective, night and day from what we've seen under Dave Haxtell and Dan Bylsma. We know it's not a very long training camp, but for you and from your perspective, for a Minnesota Wild team that, as I understand, is kind of in, on a 5-year plan. They're talking 5-year plan here. What were the important elements to the training camp and to getting this team prepared to execute on the ice?
That's a fantastic question, because we heard from a lot of different players this year that this was one of the most strenuous training camps that they've been a part of. And I think that speaks to a couple of different things. So you had John Hines come in during the season last year and was in it's a tough situation to be a coach that comes in like from outside the organization during a season. It's tough to really establish the different things that you want to do other than just kind of doing little bits and pieces on the fly. So having the entire offseason to really get a plan put together, this is the first chance that we had to really see it. And so Hines, I think, wanted these guys to be ready to go from the first drop of the puck in the regular season. But I think Bill Guerin kind of comes into play here as well, too, because what this team did last year just was not acceptable. Mm-hmm. And for as big of a looming question as I like to just, like, every once in a while, I'll kind of peek off screen and say, oh, yeah, the Kirill Kaprizov contract decision is still hiding just out of view. And so to not make the postseason and to really feel like a big kind of a step back, even though they battled all year, it just there's no scenario in which that's acceptable again this season. And so
right.
I think Bill Guerin and John Hines both wanted everybody to be ready to go from the drop. But it's like details have taken on a really big focus from John Hines on his tenure. Like the buzzword that people heard a lot under Dean Evison was that the team needs to play with grit, and to just really, do those little things and be physical and be tough and tenacious to win games. Right. With John Hines, it's been details. Need to make sure that the little details are on display. And so there was a lot of work on just, some of those fundamental things like crisp passes up the ice and stick-to-stick passes to make sure that opportunities that present themselves that you're ready for. This was on full display in the win against Columbus. The 2 goals that were scored by the Matt Boldy line were all details. Like a nice Joel Eriksson-esque screen set gives Matt Boldy a window to get one through. On the other one, there's detail work in keeping the puck in the zone. And so it's something that you're always interested to hear, because if it comes from like one player, you're like, oh, that's not good for that guy. But the fact that it came from so many is interesting, because it just speaks to like, hey, we got to be ready to go. We can't start slow this year. And it really did seem like they put in all the work to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I love that. I love that philosophy. And again, I think both of our organizations feeling the pains of last year and knowing that that's, as you said, unacceptable. That is not even close to the expectation. And so I love that. I love the commitment to details. I think the Seattle Kraken are a little bit in it's not that details aren't important, and it's that the details are changing because of the coaching change. And so there's a little bit of just recommunicating, readjusting, reestablishing that foundation to then push forward. So I'm very curious to see, which one of our teams is able to position themselves to be a perennial playoff team and make that push to be a true contender for a championship. And of course, I was talking about the Seattle Kraken in our first segment about how some of that has to come from the front office and establishing through extensions and mincing no words about the players that are critical to achieving that 5-year plan. And so for Minnesota, I mean, I think I can guess, but I'd love to hear from you, the expert, Seth. Who are some of those players putting the aces in places that are going to help be successful in this 5-year plan to a title?
We're really seeing a little bit of a changing of the guard here. This core from the last couple of seasons, guys like Marcus Foligno, like Matt Zuccarello, Ryan Hartman, some of those veteran guys that were huge reasons as to why the Wild had as successful of a season as they did in 2021, 2022. They're kind of becoming more of those secondary type players, like those supplementary players, bottom six type players that are needed, but are not the focal points of this organization. And you look at the core that this team's building. I mean, Matt Boldy, one of the recent extensions, nice little 7x7, which looks like an outrageous bargain at 23 years old, and to have already had one 30-goal scoring season and a 29-goal scoring season. That's a huge part of what this team is trying to do going forward. And the fun part, too, is having had a chance to talk to Boldy. I asked him point blank. I said, look, you're becoming a huge focal point of what this team is trying to do. How do you handle that pressure? And how do you handle those additional expectations? And he flat out said, he's like, I don't look at it as pressure. He's like, I want to be the guy in those opportunities, and I want to be the one taking those shots. And so, like, that kind of thing just screams somebody who's going to be, and he may never be number one with Kirill Kaprizov here, but definitely number two. Joel Eriksson Ek, one of the better, I think, do-it-all centers in the entire NHL. Another big piece for this team. But you look at guys, Brock Faber, who just signed his extension. That'll kick in, and just one of my favorite players to watch, because he does everything. And he was asked to do a ton of really tough things last year with Jared Spurgeon and Jonas Brodin hurt. And he stepped in. He didn't miss a beat. He broke his ribs and played through that for the final 2 months of the season. And we didn't even know about it until like off-season interviews. It's like, oh yeah, he was playing with broken ribs. We're like, what now? So, you have guys like that, but the most recent extension, Erica, I think, is the one that is going to be the big key to this. Jesper Wallstedt, who got a 2-year deal, 2.2 per year. He is expected to be the franchise goalie moving forward. And I'm not talking about just the guy that gets the most starts. The expectation is that, and he may not get to that level, but the expectation is that he is going to be a bulldog type, like Andrei Vasilevsky, like Connor Hellebuck. Like, it's going to be his net. And if you want somebody else to start, you're going to have to pull him out of it. He is a huge key to this puzzle for the Wild, because goaltending's been up and down the last few seasons, and throughout the Wild franchise, they've had a couple of franchise goalies, but he's definitely expected to be the next one. If he hits, this team's going to be in really good shape. And we're not even going to talk about what happens if he doesn't.
I mean, yeah, we have certainly ridden our fair share of up and downs with goaltending. And again, talked about it in the first segment. I don't know that we're in the clear. So lots to be determined. I do like the Decord extension, and we need to see what that's really going to look like for the Kraken. We're hearing it's going to be more of an equitable split. Is that 50-50? Is it 60-40? Is 70-30 the right balance? And all of that, of course, is predicated on health, which unfortunately has not been a strong suit for Philip Grubauer. So we'll have to see how that works. But, we already mentioned some names there, both of us, for some of this young up and coming talent. But we really want to dial into a few players and what the expectation is, especially I'll say on the Kraken side, given how things went last year. So, Seth, let's get into that coming up here on our crossover, or as I like to say, Squadcast episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Kraken.
Today's episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Kraken is brought to you by FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You should see my computer, Erica, when I'm tracking my fantasy team. I've got like 90 tabs up because I want to make sure I've got every window that I need to check every individual performance. You don't have to do that on FanDuel. It's all in one place. And the best part about it is that you'll get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. It doesn't even have to be a winner. Like, you can just go outright, hey, I think the Minnesota Wild are going to win. I think the Seattle Kraken are going to win. Regardless, $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. So head to FanDuel.com today to take advantage of this great deal. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back, Squadcast, Locked On Wild, Locked On Kraken, taking you a little closer in depth ahead of this matchup between the Wild and the Kraken at XL Energy Center. And Erica, you nailed it before the break in segment 2. We got a couple players that we intentionally didn't really go into in our discussion about each of our teams, because we're going to do that right now. You've got 2 young centers who are continuing to learn what it's like to play at the NHL level. Matty Beniers, Marco Rossi. Let's start with Matty Beniers. Got the long-term extension to be a huge piece for this Kraken team. But it seems from my vantage point, there's been a little bit of a feeling out as to what it takes at the NHL level. So heading into his third season, what are you hoping to see from Matty Beniers this year from a growth perspective?
Yeah, I think it's again one of those contracts. Another 7 was the number of the offseason for the Seattle Kraken. 7 years, 7.14 AAV, $50 million contract for Matty Beniers. Of course, is a rookie of the year candidate of yesteryear. Didn't perform though at that level last year. And I think there are a few things you can look at. And a part of it is just that Matty Beniers has to grow. I think that this contract, it both honors and respects the potential as well as what Matty has done for the Seattle Kraken while putting the ball in his court as far as what now his growth, not just potential, but what the trajectory is actually going to look like. I think another thing that the Seattle Kraken did to perhaps in good faith show Matty that they have confidence in him while also, again, setting an expectation that he will level up is that he's one of the alternate captains this year. And a lot of people in Kraken camp expecting that with Jordan Eberle being named our only second ever captain behind Mark Giordano, who did not make it past the trade deadline in the inaugural season, that this is a sign perhaps for Matty Beniers to grow in leadership under Eberle. I mentioned Larson earlier, as well as Yanni Gordon, Jaden Schwartz, the other alternate captains. So Matty Beniers does have to produce. There's just no mincing words about it. And I have confidence that he can do that. I think he's been very quiet. He hasn't spoken to us in media very much, but also I think that's a benefit that he has because there's a focus on another young center who has made the NHL roster. And of course, that is Shane Wright. So I think this is going to be a season where Matty Beniers hopefully can quietly and within his own time and headspace level up and excel. I think what's interesting about Disco Dan, as we call him, Dan Bylsma, is that he is not committed. He's not overly committed to line pairings. And so we've already seen Shane Wright and Matty Beniers be center on a few different lines. And I think that's important to do now because injuries are inevitable. You don't know that you're going to have the same roster night in. As a matter of fact, you can almost guarantee you won't have the same roster night in and night out, especially when you get to the thick of the season. So having Matty Beniers and Shane Wright be a little nimble right now, I think is going to be huge. Still not sure what this looks like for Matty B, but I hope that, again, him being able to move in silence this year is going to pay dividends as far as his performance on the ice.
And I'm glad you brought up Shane Wright too, because just quick follow up before I do a little dive into Rossi. Shane Wright came in, and I think much like Marco Rossi is, got a little taste, but just didn't really work out. And so then you put it on the player to, okay, now that you've had a little look at what it takes at the NHL level, here's what we want you to do before you come back. And so, you've had a chance to see him in preseason and even the early part of the season. Does it look like a little different Shane Wright as this season gets going?
Absolutely. And I mentioned Zame earlier. Zame loves talking about Shane Wright and his development, and rightfully so. Shane Wright, similarly to what I said about Matty Beniers, his leadership has really shown through. And he had a chance to take on a leadership role for an AHL Coachella Valley Firebirds team that went to the Calder Cup finals and lost back-to-back seasons, but they were there. And that doesn't happen by accident. That happens with hard work on the ice and good leadership. And Shane Wright has shown in training camp that he's ready. He was at rookie camp. He was, of course, at training camp, and he stepped up in a big way. I think he's still going to have to earn a lot on this particular Seattle Kraken roster, having a player like, of course, Matty Beniers, but we also mentioned Stevenson that we brought over in the offseason. But it's an opportunity for Shane and Beniers even to, again, have a little bit of that pressure taken off while learning from veterans. And that's what I like. I don't know, hybrid rebuild is sometimes what people say. The Seattle Kraken have not embraced any of that terminology, but if I had to categorize it, that's what this feels like. I think it's interesting, as you mentioned Brock Faber, and I wanted to just tap in there. We're going to talk about Rossi, but I'd also love to get your thoughts on Faber as a young defenseman, because we have one of those coming up as well in Riker Evans. And I'm curious to see how the Minnesota Wild are handling, again, kind of this turnover, as you said, changing of the guard. And what does it look like, Seth, when a team is trying to build an on-ramp for development while also be successful in winning games in the here and now?
Yeah, last year, Erica, was a perfect example of like, okay, we're going to throw a lot at you. Can you handle it?
Right.
From the Brock Faber point of view, because you had injuries to Jared Spurgeon, you had injuries to Jonas Brodin. And so you've got this guy in Brock Faber that you think is going to be pretty good. And you're like, okay, we're just gonna, we're gonna up your usage a little bit. He had one stretch in which I think he played 30 plus minutes in 6 straight games. He ran the power play. He quarterbacked the power play for a team with some pretty darn good top power play options. He had never run a power play before.
Wow.
And so he steps in. He is as quick of a study as they come. But you just see the will to win every time he's out there on the ice. And I think this is something, one of the shorts that I did for Locked On Kraken the other day, hearing Jordan Eberle talk about that with Matty Beniers and that will to win and how infectious that is for veteran players. Like, you look up and down the roster for the Minnesota Wild, especially on defense, and it seems like there just is a ton of respect for what Brock Faber brings to the table, because he's the ultimate competitor. He is going to do whatever needs to be done in order to help the Minnesota Wild win. And the Wilds were fortunate to be able to draft a guy who I think is going to be similar in Zeev Boyum, which I know.
Yes. Oh gosh.
I know that was your number one bullseye target for
Yep.
the draft.
Yep.
But he profiles as somebody that is similar. And it just, you've had two defensemen in Jared Spurgeon and Jonas Brodin on this team for a long time, guys in similar mindsets that are like, we're going to do whatever it takes. We're going to do whatever is necessary to go out and win games. And it's just the easiest way to really endear yourself to your team is I'm throwing my entire body out there to block a shot. He had one of the craziest plays that I've ever seen as somebody who had played like 2 NHL games when he first came up against the Dallas Stars in the postseason. Philip Gustafsson had sprawled out to make an initial save and the rebound came free. And he came flying out of nowhere and throws his stick out to block a shot. It's like, those are the kinds of things that really endear you to your teammates. And, on the Marco Rossi side of things, he did the same thing. He had, I think, the quote of the year last year. He said, "Every day I come to the rink and I just try to do my best and to help the team win." And like, give me a full roster of those types of guys. And I think the team is going to end up doing just fine. So, it's a situation where you've got veterans and you're never going to have like a full rookie lineup. You're always going to have veterans on your team. And so having some of those rookies that come in and want to be like part of that group is just, it's super infectious. And it's so much fun to follow those types of guys.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that sounds amazing. As much as I love defense, I couldn't end this squad cast without asking you about some young defensemen on the roster. But, we do have a game coming up where we'll be adversaries. So not just in the WNBA finals as a New Yorker going up and chatting with the Minnesota guy, but also here as the Seattle Kraken will be on the road and hosted by the Minnesota Wild. I honestly think it's too early to make predictions with any certainty here. So I like asking this question. If we see the best brand of Minnesota Wild hockey that exists at this current moment, Seth, what would that look like? What is happening on the ice that makes you certain that they're in the zone and they're feeling it?
I think it's going to come down to seeing just torrential levels of attack from Kirill Kaprizov's line and from Matt Boldy's line. We saw a good amount of that from Boldy's line in game 1. Kirill's line was a little more quiet. And so it's not going to be the case every night. If Kirill is able to, do his thing and to help really push, I think that's when you see the Wild doing their best brand of hockey. There were some points during the Columbus game where they just kind of got stuck in mud. And so avoiding that, playing up tempo, playing fast, giving the home crowd something to cheer about is the big thing that it comes down to. But yeah, it starts and ends with me with seeing those first two lines really push the issue and try to get as many looks as they can on net.
Yeah, it's more of the same, honestly, for the Seattle Kraken. I think they started well against St. Louis. And as Eberle said, 4 minutes in the second period, and they lost track and they lost sight of what they wanted to do from an execution standpoint. And that's all that an NHL caliber team needs, right? And so those slippages cannot happen. But when the Seattle Kraken are playing their best brand of hockey that exists right now, that's what they're doing. They're peppering, in the zone. They're not just one and done in the offensive zone. They're finding ways to attack the net. I think over time, what we'll see is that the Seattle Kraken will also establish more of a net front presence. We're not a big team. We're not a bruiser kind of hockey team. So being very nimble in front of net is going to be huge. And I love that you mentioned, what line you think is working the best. According to Dan Bylsma, it's actually Wright centering Ellie Tolvanen and Oliver Bjorkstrand. Independently, each one of those skaters that are kind of, as far as me for the Seattle Kraken, are some of my favorite. I just like how they attack the game, and to have them on a line together I think is really powerful and has yielded positive results. But again, sounds like we might not always see that line together, at least to begin with. So I'm curious to see how things will roll out. And again, how Matty Beniers starts to assert himself, because that's not necessarily something that we saw in the handful of preseason games and even the first game of the regular season.
Well, it should be a fun one between these two teams. Looking forward to just getting back to the X and seeing things unfold in person. Erica, great time as always. Thank you for hopping in to join me here today. And for listeners, nobody has you on lock better than Locked On. Whether it be the Minnesota Wilds, whether it be the Seattle Kraken, we got you covered all week long. So make sure to subscribe. Make sure to follow us on your favorite audio platforms so you don't miss out on any news and notes throughout the week. We get you covered with new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.